Good evening and welcome back to Sunday Evening Devotions. Tonight we want to look at the story that we remember probably most of us from childhood of David and Goliath from 1 Samuel chapters 17 and 18. You may remember that David went and he picked up stones. That was his only weapon against this experienced soldier named Goliath, this giant of a man. We often picture David as a young shepherd boy. Well, I believe he was young, but probably older than we often picture him. He was probably in his early 20s. He had experience. He had fought off bears and lions. He wasn't just a young boy, but compared to Goliath, yep, experienced and very young. The context here of our story is that as Saul moves forward in his kingship, that he is more and more isolated from God. He's more and more concerned about himself. The Philistines are pressing upon him, and the Philistines like a battle, and they also enjoyed having a champion, probably because a number of their people were giants of the land, and so that was what they did. They put forth their champion before Israel and said, if whoever wins the war. Why waste all the men? We'll just put out your champion and let's have a battle. Let's watch the contest. Well, the Israelites, following Saul and Saul's lack of faith in God's care and providence, quaked at this whole prospect. David had returned home, and from the court of Saul, apparently, and Jesse then sent him back to Saul's court, more or less, as they were encamped against the Philistines, because David's older brothers were part of the army. They were doing their bit. But what we find is that they are just as fearful as everyone else. There is a lack of faith in Israel. David, however, hears the tauntings of Goliath and is outraged that no one believes that God will indeed give them the battle victory. And so he makes it known that he believes, and so what we find is that David then gives testimony to his faith. He believes that God will do a great work. He testifies of God's deliverance of David in the past, how he had stood against the bear and the lion by God's own care. He testifies of his personal faith. He testifies of his confidence in God to do what everybody else is failing to believe that God will do. And he takes action. He acts in faith, and so says to King Saul, send me and I will go and take care of Goliath. There's a bit about Saul trying to dress David in his armor, but it doesn't fit David, and that's not what David's about. It's all about trusting in God's provision. So he comes up against Goliath with a smooth stone and his slingshot. Goliath, of course, is outraged and is laughing at this shepherd young man who would come to oppose him as the champion of Israel. But you see, the real champion of Israel is not a particular man. It is God himself. And of course, yes, in the future, it will be the God-man, the Lord Jesus Christ, pictured for us in David and his great faith as he stands against Goliath and his tauntings. And you know how the story goes. David defeats the champion, Goliath, and cuts his head off, and the Philistines are routed. And what we find is that David's testimony of faith inspires others. They have faith, and they then take part. Jonathan is encouraged, and the people begin to recount David's victories as Saul then sees David, particularly, a leader, and he's sent him out to take care of Saul's business against his enemies. Well, of course, David is blessed by God, and this angers Saul. The more that Saul puts David in danger, the more that God delivers him. And so while the people rejoice in David's victories, and while David acts faithfully, Saul, ever looking at himself, becomes angry with David and sets himself against David. And we see that this was all about God trying to encourage Saul to put his trust in God himself and what God would do. But of course, Saul was concerned about himself and his kingship. And so he decides to test David in a particular way, to entrap him. He reminds David again that he had promised at the battle of Goliath that the victor would win his daughter. Well, his oldest daughter had already been given in marriage, and so he suggests that David marry his next daughter, Michal. Michal loves David. This isn't what Saul expects, and Saul is hoping to entrap David in all of this and making him a family member and be, owing something to Saul. But of course, that doesn't work out. Saul sends David out on a mission to win his wife. Since he doesn't have a dowry, since he's a poor man, he sends him out to bring back evidence of killing the Philistines. David does it. He doesn't get killed, but in fact is victorious. God provides for him. Saul is even more angry. Saul then seeks to kill David. Jonathan defends him. And so again, we find that while Saul is rejecting David, God is making David popular and promising and blessed in the eyes of the people, because David is acting in faith. And there's a lesson there. When we act in faith, we encourage others. And of course, it is the Lord Jesus Christ who came and acted in faith. He came believing in the purposeful redemption that God would provide for his people, agreed to take upon that responsibility and obedience for God's glory. And he then is the victor. And that encourages us. You see, that is our hope. That is our confidence, not in men. But the battle belongs to the Lord, particularly the battle against sin, the battle against death itself, because it is Jesus who's come. Well, that's good news. Good night.